It is a joy to be with you today and to take some time during this very thought-provoking conference to focus on a topic that is close to all of our hearts, which is the criminal legal system. When the topic of this year's conference was announced over the summer, I was trying to scheme to think about how I could get here with a group of students from the University of Wisconsin. And I thought, okay, well, we need a panel, clearly. And I thought, well, where does criminal justice fit into the idea of the goodness of creation? Those don't seem to go together very well. And the question occurred to me, what would the criminal system look like if we actually believed the people in it were good? And since I have posed that question to colleagues since, when I talk about the plan for this panel, all of them laugh when I say that, because there is such a stark contrast between that idea and the reality of how we have structured our system and how we execute it on a daily basis, despite a profound commitment by Christians to the fundamental and inherent goodness of the human person. The way that we treat every aspect of criminal justice, from our responses to crime victims to the prosecution and sentencing of criminal defendants and those who are convicted, seems to betray that fundamental concept. So when I was thinking about this, and I'm going to sketch out and suggest a couple of different ways that this might have implications for the legal structure of our system, but I want to back up before then to think about why it is that we ought to recommit ourselves to invest in our beliefs in the fundamental goodness of all people, including those who are prosecuted. We've been talking for the last 2 days about how God, at the completion of creation after making man, looked at what he made and saw that it was very good. In the Catholic tradition, unlike some other Christian traditions, we believe that while sin wounds us, it wounds man, it injures our human solidarity, it doesn't fundamentally alter the inherent goodness of the person. It does not erase the image of God that's inalterable at its most fundamental level. And we certainly believe that once Christ has come and redeemed us, the ability of man to be completely reconciled and restored is complete and available to all people. And the continued existence of sin in the world, right, something with which we are all much too familiar at a personal level, doesn't negate the fundamental goodness of the person. Our sinfulness, right, our concupiscence can both coexist with a commitment to the sense of who we are as people. In other words, when we look at ourselves, and ideally when we look at those around us, what we see are people who are fallen, who are not yet perfected, but who still, we hope, can be perfected, can be made better. I am not convinced that when we look at the people in our courtrooms whom we are prosecuting, our judges and our prosecutors, and quite frankly, our public defenders and members of our community in those spaces look with that kind of hope on the people that we are prosecuting. And even on those who've been harmed by crime, we often relegate them to a role that is diminished, right? That they are problems to be managed rather than people to be invested in and celebrated. And that seems to me a fundamental problem that Christians, and Catholics in particular, are well positioned to combat and push against. So what does that actually mean? What would it mean to look with hope on those in our courtrooms? I'm going to talk about the implications for the substantive criminal law and for sentencing laws in particular. My colleagues will speak to other aspects of this system, I want to suggest that what I'm going to talk about is probably the smallest sliver of the implications for this concept, because certainly conditions of confinement, criminal procedures, right, the way we interact with people, and certainly aspects of procedural justice are all deeply, deeply implicated by this kind of a reconsideration of our norms. But I do think that it's worth taking a little time to talk about the legal structures that form the basis of state authority over people's behavior and authorize the state to deprive them of liberty. So I think we could start with the substantive criminal law itself, right? What are the kinds of behaviors that we say are not only disordered or undesirable, but are worthy of the sanction of criminal stigma, right? That we're going to label them bad and criminal, and that we are going to authorize the potential deprivation of liberty of the person. And I would suggest that as people who are invested in the goodness of others, we ought to want to be quite circumspect, parsimonious in our definition of the kinds of behaviors that would rise to the level of criminality, right? We know that particularly in the United States, having the label criminal, particularly the label felon, attached to socially undesirable behavior has long-lasting effects on people, not only in terms of reputational interests, but also in terms of legal interests. Not only are people subject to the formal sanction of criminal sentencing, but they are also subject to myriad and extended collateral consequences of criminal conviction that often alter their life course as a result, restricting their ability to access everything from public benefits to occupational licenses, limit their ability to adopt children and to serve as guardians for their elderly parents. Right? We put them in a different class of people when we label them criminal. And I would suggest that there often is not reason to do that, and yet we do it anyway. All of us engage in disordered behavior, and a quick survey of our history suggests that there have been many whom we celebrate who we could label as criminal, as felons, and see differently. Right? If you want to look at just bad behavior itself, certainly St. Paul would have self-nominated in that category, right? His participation in the martyrdom of St. Stephen is no small thing if you want to look at not necessarily behavior that would have been deemed illegal, but certainly behavior that is immoral and would constitute crimes should we choose to define them as such, right? Participating in homicide of a person who is innocent. We certainly have many saints, St. Dismas being the most famous, right, the good thief. It's always bothered me that St. Dismas's feast day is perpetually hidden. That seems so right? His feast day is the Feast of the Annunciation, so it will never be celebrated. And I'm like, of course, the patron saint of prisoners has that hidden feast day. But there are others as well, right? Some of whom were not criminalized because they were monarchs, and so their participation, I think of St. Olga and her participation in genocide, in retribution for what she saw as crimes against her family, had more than sordid pasts. But when we look at the saints, we don't see them as felons or former mass murderers. We see them as they are meant to be, in the fullness of who they have become, without the taint and stain of their past. Yet how reticent we are to let go of the label of felon for people who commit often fairly trifling, right, crimes or fairly time-limited crimes that we as Americans decide to punish, that are often very, very tightly correlated with things like socioeconomic disadvantage, right? We have a perpetual label that is at odds with our own sense of who people are and who they are called to be, and more problematically, can perpetuate identities. I have done bad things. I've told lies in my life. It's true. I'm sorry for it. But I don't go around calling myself or being called an ex-liar. That's not my identity, right? And you can all think of things, I'm sure, that you've done. And you don't go around identifying as the ex whatever it is that you were. A slanderer, right? Assaulter, people hit people, right? And yet, people are either felons or ex-felons. Those seem to be the only two categories that we have for them once they've been convicted of a crime. All of that to go back to my first point, which is to say we ought to be very, very careful about applying that label to people in the first instance. And so we ought to be particularly concerned about things like the growth of crime, strict liability, crime in the United States, crime, any kind of criminal behavior that is punishing mental states that are not at least reckless or intentional. Right? We ought to be concerned when we are giving people these labels that change their self-identities, as well as our relationship as a community to them for long periods of time. It seems incompatible with our sense of their inherent dignity and goodness to put them in a category that is very, very difficult to escape from. In addition, I would suggest that there are two ways that sentencing ought to be affected by a shift to focus on the goodness of those in our system. The first of those is in the maximum penalties that we authorize for crime in the first instance. So it would seem to me that while it is appropriate and dignified to hold people accountable for bad behavior, right, to expect them to restore to the degree possible harms that they have created, right, to assist crime victims when possible, and to tell the truth about what they have done and what they have done has caused damage. We also need to respond in a way that is measured and proportional and human in its dimensions. Too often, both the rhetoric and the practice in our courtrooms is a caricature of itself. We make a caricature out of defendants. We make a caricature out of crime victims. And the punishments that we authorize are so inflated that they themselves feel not real and not human in their scale. So let me give an example of what I mean by this. It would seem to me that when we impose a punishment on an 18-year-old offender, however serious the crime that that young person has committed, we ought to take account of who that young person, I would say child because I'm getting old now, so now 18-year-olds seem like kids to me. I have 6 kids who are over 18. It makes me think that we ought to take account of the fact that for that young person, a 9-year sentence is half a lifetime, right? We don't think about it that way. We have this abstracted, mathematical, unscaled version of how we think about time. Not for ourselves, mind you, because most of us, if we think about spending even a day or two in jail, would kind of freak out. But for others, even my most progressive students, I find, often act as though anything less than a decade in prison is like, whatever, right? Why? Because we have just been desensitized to the human scale of punishment. Right? We're so used to hearing big numbers that we don't respond by thinking about lost birthdays and Christmases, right? Opportunities to attend funerals and weddings. We don't think for young men and women who are sentenced to long periods of time behind bars about lost reproductive years and the ability to build and grow a family and a future together. We don't think in human terms, right? And we certainly don't think, going back to that 18-year-old, about the percentage of lifetime that is being lost. Although we know that we change a lot. There are probably some law students in the room. 1L to 3L year, you're like a different human being, right? Like so much growth happens in especially the young adult years. We're not sensitive to that. And then finally, I would say, the second way in which we see sentencing being impacted or potentially impacted by this would be recognizing that to the degree we don't yet live in a legal system or function in a legal system that is tailored to the human person and the human lifespan and to what we know about human development, we need to create more mechanisms of amelioration, right? And I know this is controversial, right? We don't like to alter things. We like finality in criminal punishment. But I would suggest that the human person is inherently changeable and redeemable, right? And that's what we believe when we look at goodness. We believe that you can go from being someone who is recalcitrant and engaged in harm-causing behavior to someone who begins to see others as your brother and sister in Christ, and who can change and who can grow. And our legal system needs to create opportunities to recognize those kind of changes so that we are not keeping the giftedness and the potential and the goodness of our brothers and sisters who have been involved in the criminal legal system hidden for long periods of time that aren't justified, given what we know of their dignity and their potential. So, thank you.
It's fitting that Cecelia mentioned St. Dismas. I'm beginning with him. I think it's an important way to think about the criminal and their hope in the beatific vision of God. Looking at Scripture, Luke 23, 39 to 43, one of the criminals who were hanged railed at him, saying, "Are you not the Christ? Save yourself and us." But the other rebuked him, saying, "Do you not fear God, since you are under the same sentence of condemnation? And we indeed justly, for we are receiving the due reward of our deeds. But this man has done nothing wrong." And he said, "Jesus, remember me when you come to your kingly power." And he said to him, "Truly I say to you, today you will be with me in paradise." St. Dismas reflects this reality that he sees Christ not as the other thief sees him, as just Jesus, the historical man. He sees Jesus Christ. It's through his use of reason that he's able to recognize that this is not just an ordinary human being. The gift of faith interacts with his gift of reason to perceive that this is something more. This man is dying for our sins on the cross, and he asks for God's mercy. I'm talking today on solitary confinement and its issues with us being able to use that, or the prisoners being able to use their gift of reason. We really severely limit it. I just want to begin with some quotes from the Catechism that just reflect this reality, and what the church teaches. So the church teaches this perfect life with the most holy Trinity, this communion of life and love with the Trinity, with the Virgin Mary, the angels, and all the blessed, is called heaven. Heaven is the ultimate end and fulfillment of the deepest human longing, the state of supreme, definitive happiness. Then, because of his transcendence, God cannot be seen as he is, unless he himself opens up his mystery to man's immediate contemplation and gives him the capacity for it. The church calls this contemplation of God in his heavenly glory the beatific vision. Scripture also lays this out for us and defines eternal life clearly. And this is eternal life, that they know thee, the only true God, and Jesus Christ, whom thou hast sent. They know God. There's a use of reason. It's not just the facts about him, but they know him personally, as St. Dismas did on the cross that day. I'll look at the history of solitary confinement and just kind of lay out some foundational. America, we've institutionalized it. It existed in the medieval period. Think St. Thomas More being left in the tower alone. We elevated this to an extent that is just not seen in human history, especially since the 80s and 90s. New York recently passed legislation that limits it to 15 days. But the typical experience in solitary confinement is that you are in your cell for 23 hours a day in isolation. That hour a day that you're allowed to leave is to go into an isolated pen outside for your recreation time. It's still in isolation. One of the prisoners, when the New York legislation came out, said, "I walked right into hell. The cell was like an elevator. You're stuck in for 24 hours." I want to look at solitary confinement in a particular person. This case was before the Supreme Court. It's been since mooted, so it's not going to go anywhere. This Hope versus Harris. Dennis Wayne Hope. Let's look at what the state said in their brief when they started to get worried that this case was going to go forward. The state opens this way. Dennis Wayne Hope is serving an 80-year sentence for a string of violent armed robberies. He has escaped or attempted to escape from Texas prisons often enough to inspire a television episode about his criminal exploits. After a successful escape, during which Hope shut down the electricity to an entire maximum security prison, fled to another state, and committed additional violent crimes, including carjacking an unarmed 83-year-old man at knife point, Hope is placed in restrictive housing. He received periodic reviews to determine whether it would be safe to move him to the general population. Several years ago, it was determined that staff no longer needed a flight risk warning on Hope's file, but other safety concerns kept him in restrictive housing. This sounds like exactly what Cecelia is saying, is that Texas does not see the potential for good in this man, so they've left him in solitary confinement for 25 straight years. And he received annual reviews that didn't really amount to much. It's just sort of pushing paper. I want to look at what his allegations were of what was going on in his solitary confinement cell. So he contested in his brief that one of the guards about 10 years in planted a knife in one of his cells. The state said that's just not possible. Our guards wouldn't do that. But a man who's in solitary confinement for 23 hours a day who doesn't interact with other prisoners, it's highly unlikely that he got a knife in his cell. It just doesn't really make sense. He was also, after that point, they determined, now you're dangerous, so we have to move you in between cells at least weekly. So he was put in cells that had black mold, covered in feces, covered in urine. He was pepper sprayed and left in cells for 24 hours straight a day. He was accompanied by prison guards to his psychological appointments. When he filed his Eighth Amendment claim for cruel and unusual punishment, only one of the defendants that he named, one of the prison officials, was left after pleading, because it was determined under the Eighth Amendment that the prison officials weren't deliberately indifferent. They didn't know that the things that were happening to her were bad. When you look at the size of solitary confinement cells, when you put a prison in there and open it up, you will smell urine, you will smell feces, you will smell black mold, you will see a guy suffering under the effects of pepper spray that is just asking for basic materials to clean himself in his own cell. It's hard to fathom how the court didn't think that was deliberately indifferent. So a prisoner is looking for hope in the system, and it's just not going to happen in the court system under the current constitutionality of solitary confinement. I want to look briefly at the history to understand how we got here in the United States. The first solitary confinement prison we opened up was in 1787 in Pennsylvania. It's the Walnut Street Penitentiary. The Quakers opened this as a hope for rehabilitation for prisoners. That's why they called it a penitentiary penance. It didn't work very quickly. The news at the time recounts many prisoners quickly fell into a semi-fatuous condition from which it was next to impossible to arouse them, and others became violently insane. Others still committed suicide, and in most cases did not recover sufficient mental activity to give any subsequent service to the community. We tried it. It completely failed. But in the American way, we tried again. Pennsylvania tries again. Western State Penitentiary a few years later. Health quickly failed. In New York, fittingly to start on Christmas Day, what a gift. Muscle atrophy and devastating effect on mental health. We closed that one. Eastern State Penitentiary, Pennsylvania tries again. Health concerns. New Jersey also tried it, also failed. The Supreme Court, in the first case considering solitary confinement in 1890, it was really a death penalty case, but they talk about solitary in it, remarks, it seems to us that the considerations which we have here suggested show that solitary confinement, to which the prisoner was subjected by the Statute of Colorado in 1889, and by the judgment of the court in pursuance of that statute, was an additional punishment of the most important and painful character, and is therefore forbidden by this ex post facto provision of the Constitution of the United States. So they viewed it as they're adding this punishment in as this man's awaiting the death penalty. This is too much. It has to be part of his sentencing. We've abandoned that, just in case you're curious. In the early 20th century, we pick it up again. Alcatraz is the major offender. It has these Spanish dungeon-style cells, which are just in the basement, completely dark. And the prisoners are just left there. You'll see California news at the time. They were pretty irate about this. They didn't like it, but it lasted about 40, or what, 20, 30, 40 years. What does modern solitary confinement look like? When did we try this again? There was still a gap. We tried it with this federal control and rehabilitation effort, this program START, Missouri Special Treatment and Rehabilitation Training. Both programs experimented with the techniques of brainwashing piloted in military training exercises, placing prisoners in extreme isolation without reading materials or human contact, and then gradually relaxing the conditions of confinement as prisoners met behavioral benchmarks. Do you think you're going to meet behavioral benchmarks when you're put in complete confinement from human beings and even reading materials you just left to yourself all day? I didn't do well with like the 14 days at the beginning of COVID. And I was able to leave. Then we see the rise of the Supermax prison in the United States. First one built in 1986. A Supermax is a super maximum security prison. It's a unit or an entire prison designated for prisoners for solitary confinement. So we've decided to build prisons in a way that we can keep prisoners in solitary confinement. We do this for various reasons. Some of it is violent offenders. They're just too dangerous to be kept in general population is the argument. The other is they were a confidential informant, and it's a danger for them to be left in the prison. Gang violence is a reality. Here in town, we have 4 pods in our jail. We have more than 4 gangs. If you're not one of the 4 larger gangs, you're put in solitary as the default as you're waiting your trial. So we also view it as this default. We also put a lot of child molesters are put in here just because the prison population doesn't do very well with them. Prison is just violent. We haven't really found a way to address it well, so we just put you in solitary for an indefinite period of time and hope that's fine. There are some times when someone is in solitary until they're about to be released from prison, and then they come back into the general population, and we hope they're not going to be recidivist. We hope that they're going to be able to come back and join the human community after being in prison for about a decade, most of which spent in solitary confinement, then come back and rejoin us and not go back. It just doesn't work, obviously. What are the numbers right now of people in solitary? It's estimated between 40 to 80,000 at a time are in solitary confinement. And about 20% of prisoners who go through the system will spend some time in solitary confinement. What do the courts recognize that are the psychological effects? This is a pretty big litany, but let's see what the courts have recognized. Psychotic spectrum symptoms of paranoia and hallucinations, mood spectrum symptoms of depression, withdrawal, appetite and sleep disturbance, fatigue and lethargy, and suicidal ideation, anxiety spectrum symptoms of subjective distress, feelings of impending doom, somatic complaints, dissociative experience, and ruminative thoughts, affective ability characterized by irritability, rage and aggressive impulses, and behavioral self-control, symptoms of aggression, assaults, self-mutilation. I think of a case that was recently in town. This guy was arguing, he was in solitary, and he had developed to a state where he was just throwing feces at the guards through his cells. So the solution to that was we put plexiglass on his cell. The problem was these prisons aren't air conditioned, and it was summer, and he had a heat stroke. I was watching a guard on the stand defend that he had enough airflow because there was 2 inches at the bottom of the plexiglass at which he got air through. That was the ventilation for his cell. The conditions that we subject solitary prisoners to are just unacceptable. I argue this because they inhibit the ability for the person to reason, to arrive at this understanding of God like St. Dismas did. I want to look at the painting, Salisbury Cathedral by John Constable. In the bottom right, you see the cattle grazing. They have no reason to look up at this cathedral. They have no reason to look to the sky. They just eat their grass, moo, and move on. Now, to the left, you see the bishop with a man, and he's pointing up. He's looking to God in this cathedral, but even higher to the heavens. Now, let's compare this to what a typical cell looks like. You might have a little window. In some places, you might have a view of the mountains of the desert, but it's that little slit. You might have a TV, likely not, because they're going to, as punishment, and you're just left in the cell on your own all day long. There's no one to accompany you. So not only do you have your loss of the use of reason, you've lost your community. You've lost your community of people who are able to move you towards God. You're even put out of contact of the chaplains. You're just left in this cell all on your own. I just want to close with thoughts on what solutions could look like. I mentioned this earlier, but the courts are not really a solution. Until Breyer retired, there were 3 justices who have signaled that they would like to take a solitary confinement case. Justice Jackson hasn't made that clear. The current conditions of confinement test is you have to show an objective harm. The circuits are split whether prolonged solitary confinement, more than 15 days, is a measure of that harm. And then the other part is you have to show that you're deliberately indifferent. And that's not just negligent. The prison officials have to be told that what is happening is wrong and act indifferent to what they know. That's a really high standard for a prisoner who is going to be litigating this without an attorney at the trial level. They have to plead this on their own. So when you look at Mr. Hope's file, he actually has good handwriting, and you're able to see his pleading that didn't make it, but you're able to see he's trying to make this claim and show like they ignored me, but he can't do it. New York has shown some hope. They've limited it to 15 days. This follows with the UN's guidelines. The UN has recommended that prisoners only be left in solitary for 15 days, and they lower the time to 22 hours, so 2 hours outside of the cell. The legislature is probably more hope on this, but we need a cultural shift in how we think of how we want to treat our prisoners and if we see the good in them. Thank you.
Well, thanks a lot to whoever organized this panel and has me following that with the PowerPoint as well. It makes me a little bit nervous, but perhaps, yeah, well, that's pretty enough. Mine will actually seg very nicely from Mike's wonderful and insightful and knowledgeable discussion of solitary confinement. One thing I'll add is I'm happy to talk about the legal structures as well regarding solitary confinement. I don't talk much about them in this discussion. What I want to focus on is what Mike mentioned. I want to apply it a bit more broadly, which is our human capacity for reason as a core aspect of our human dignity and what this means for our approach to criminal punishment. So God is perfect reason. So in the beginning was Logos, and the Logos is God, says the evangelist. This essential nature of God is imprinted on us, for God created man in his image. So our dignity as human beings, of course, does not depend on our personal reflection of some perfect or high capacity for reason. Indeed, a person who lacks some capacity or even most capacity for reason may nonetheless receive revelation and know the truth of God and come to know his divinity, much as a person could with the highest faculties of human reason. Nonetheless, most persons have at least some capacity for reason, and this is a conduit, a pathway for us to know God's truth and to come to know God himself. So respecting this human capacity for reason and moral agency becomes essential to just punishment. And as Cecelia has rightly noted, we already premise our system of punishment on a notion of culpability, on a notion of moral agency. Convictions depend on a determination of culpable and at least minimally reasoned punishment, with the controversial exception of strict liability crimes. But what relevance does the human capacity for reason and moral choice have after an offender has committed this culpable crime and been procedurally properly convicted? So I would argue that, at least from a Catholic perspective, it means that the state and we as a community must respect and seek to preserve this reasoning nature of the person being subjected to criminal punishment. Merely confining punishment within the bounds of blameworthiness and moral agency is not sufficient to respect the dignity of the condemned. This substantive limit, based on culpability, on condemnatory punishment must be coupled with ongoing and express engagement with the reasoning nature and dignity of the condemned. So I want to illustrate this argument, this point, with 3 examples in which our criminal justice system in America diverges from this kind of respect that we ought to see for the reasoning nature of the condemned. And the first is in sentencing, the process of sentencing itself. So if punishment is to be imposed in a manner consistent with the dignity of the condemned, it must be an act of engagement and not of objectification and exclusion. Thus, a sentencing decision ought to be reasoned and communicative. Not only should the punishment itself carry communicative value as expressive condemnation, as philosopher Anthony Duff has so ably explained, but it itself must be reasoned and expressly conveyed in reasoned terms to the criminal offender so that he may understand the state's reason for his suffering. Such reason is often omitted in actual sentencing practice. In American law, sentencing typically involves a judge's selection of a sentence based on a series of statutory sentencing objectives, including typically retribution, deterrence, incapacitation, sometimes rehabilitation, and as well as typically a very technically complex calculation of an applicable guidelines range based on relevant facts. Now, when selecting a penalty based on these statutory considerations and sometimes guidelines considerations, judges are rarely required to explain how they arrived at a particular sentence other than to mention relevant facts and law. They are not required to explain the rationale or the purpose for imposing this suffering on the offender, the animating purposes that explain why we would cause this harm to another person, another child of God. The offender thus is left with an announcement, not an explanation. An announcement of the state's imposition of the penalty, not a dialogue in which the state invites the offender to understand the purpose of his sanction and to change, to enact a moral change in response to it. The offender is like an animal to be caged, for whom the capacity for reasoned understanding is either missing or irrelevant. Such treatment dehumanizes the offender and teaches those who observe the sentencing process to view offenders as no longer participating in our shared humanity and capacity for moral understanding. It thus perpetuates a twofold harm. First, on the offender, who is denied an opportunity to contemplate and internalize the legitimate reasons for his suffering. And second, on society, which is permitted to forget the humanity of the condemned. We need exactly the opposite. We need to be compelled to face the shared and equal dignity of the condemned and to continue to engage with them as our fellow man. Another instance in which American criminal punishments conflict with this respect for the reasoning moral agency of persons lies in our systems of incarceration as warehousing. Imprisonment in America typically involves severe deprivations, intrusions, isolation, violence, boredom, and meaninglessness, all of which are seeds for recidivism and resentment. Too rarely do we structure prison life to foster an introspective analysis of one's own culpability and the harms of the criminal acts of which one has been convicted. Only some prisons, and only for some prisoners within them, offer programs that, for example, invite offenders to meet with victims or victims' representatives in what is called victim impact education, which usually entails dialogue and discussion that illuminates the harms of crimes and that encourages a sense of personal responsibility on the part of offenders. Such programs are examples of how we can recognize and engage directly with offenders as persons who retain their capacity for reason, for moral choice, and for moral change, not mere animals to be confined safely until release. Yet our correctional institutions and correctional administrators are trained and empowered to treat imprisonment as confinement, to prioritize safety and security. They are neither taught to view their task as punishment, nor as building an interactive and engaging life in which we train ourselves as well as offenders to view each other as part of the same community. The problem that I wish to illuminate is not that conditions in prison are cruel or harsh or criminogenic or that they fail to rehabilitate. That is all surely true. But a call for leniency is not the point here. It is a call for respect. And this respect is owed regardless of the severity of the punishments that we impose. This respect requires reasoning engagement with the offender as a moral agent. Let me now turn to my third and most striking example of the divergence between our current approach to punishment and the respect that we owe those convicted of crimes. And this is exactly what we have already heard from Mike, and so I can be brief, but only to supplement his analysis with a few words regarding our use of the practice of long-term solitary confinement. Solitary confinement is the exact opposite of the reasoned engagement with offenders. Not only does it involve a demoralizing and cruel isolation, an isolation that removes offenders from community and the opportunities for reason and virtue in response to the needs and emotions and necessities of those around them. It deprives offenders of that opportunity for reasoned virtue and moral growth. Not only does it do that, but it distorts and degrades the human capacity to reason by heightening the risk of mental illness, by creating repetitive thoughts, and by leading to self-destructive behavior, as Mike has mentioned, offenders eating off their own limbs and doing other kinds of self-destruction. Solitary confinement thus conflicts with the reasoning nature of man as a moral agent in two ways: by denying the prisoner the opportunity for reasoned and moral engagement with others, and by corroding the core capacity for reason, most significantly for those offenders, those prisoners who have already been enduring mental disabilities. It thus goes directly against the dignity of man as a reflection of God as reason, degrading one of his greatest tools for understanding and approaching God. Thus, Pope Francis has been absolutely right to denounce solitary confinement, which he has described as a form of torture, but not only in its cruelty, but in its destruction and distortion of our reflection of divinity itself. I've thus given you three situations in which our approach to criminal justice in America conflicts with the vision of the Imago Dei. There are certainly others that I would be more than happy to address in Q&A, including the way that we imprison more generally persons who have committed crimes who suffer from mental disabilities. I will leave that to the Q&A because I think we have a lot of topics that we'd love to address. Thank you.
And since all of our presenters have been so timely, I will take up 5 minutes. Just a second. We'll get to questions in just a minute. I'm going to add 3 quick points from the perspective of canon law. Well, 2 points from the perspective of canon law, and one something that I've been ruminating on and just haven't quite chewed yet. And we'll start with that one. It's the definition of justice itself. How do we define justice? And how does our understanding of this most basic word then not only infiltrate but animate our understanding of a legal system? So traditionally, the most traditional definition of justice, you see it in Roman law, suum cuique, to each what he deserves. But in a faith that believes that we deserve nothing, that what we are given is grace, is gift, how do we begin to structure a legal system, a system of justice that takes into account the roles of grace and mercy? Is there something inherent in grace and mercy from a religious perspective that would necessarily influence our understanding of what a legal system, a just legal system, should actually look like? I don't have the answer. Just telling you, I've been ruminating on it. Last time I ruminated on it, it took over 20 minutes, so we won't go into that rumination, I promise. The 2 points from canon law. The first, anyone who's suffered through one of my classes, or worse, read one of my papers on penal law, knows that I think that the apex of Catholic legal thought around questions of penal law is found in the end of the 7th century, canon 102, the very last canon of the Council in Trullo. Or if you're a fan of Latin history, it's known by the title Quini Sextum, the fifth, between the 5th and the 6th. So the 5th and the 6th ecumenical councils didn't promulgate any legislation. They meet in the year 691 into 692, and they promulgate 102 canons. And the very last of these is, in my opinion, the heart and soul of a genuinely Catholic understanding of what penal law is supposed to do, because it takes as its model the role of the confessor facing a sinner. And it presents this model based on the image of the Good Shepherd. And these are the words in the heart of the canon are, you know, God does everything in his power to go after the lost sheep. And in doing so, the bishop, or the priest, the confessor, must have this attitude, and in this attitude must see himself as the physician who's trying to heal an illness, which is sin. But sin, it says, and it's the most insightful, psychologically insightful, spiritually insightful line of the canon, it says, sin is not a simple disease. It branches out and it takes root in different parts of life if it's not treated early. So the understanding that our inclination to sin, our concupiscence, our downward bent will, as the Council of Trent will eventually define concupiscence, this proclivity we have to sin, if it is not treated, will eventually take over every aspect of our life. So the role of penal law in the church is to treat that illness, which is sin, but to view it as an illness. So it is something that is, while intrinsic to the fallen nature of man, also is in some sense external to his reality. Doesn't change his goodness. It's something that's added to him in his fallen nature, and therefore must be treated like a disease. And then again, it says, how do you treat it? You treat it the way you do any disease, by preventing, it says, from leading someone to despair by a punishment that is too harsh, or by leading them to laxity with a punishment that is too mild. So finding that middle ground, not where the punishment fits the crime, but where the punishment fits the offender, which is an entirely different perspective. Fine. Third point, second point from canon law, third point, and then we will take questions, because Christian is ready in the back with a question. The third point from canon law is this, and it's a trend that I think in a certain way is inherently contradictory to everything else that Pope Francis has done when speaking about the civil criminal reform, where we've taken the justification of the death penalty out of the catechism, we've condemned rightly condemned solitary confinement as being a form of torture. But in all of that, there's also a movement in canon law in the recent reform of the penal code toward a strict liability crime. So there's this inherent tension there, that even within the Catholic legal system, the same legislator who condemns the use of the death penalty in civil law and condemns the use of solitary confinement and all of the underpinnings of this, again, there's this understanding of this strict liability crime, because in canon law, we talk about imputability, which is this, sort of mathematical formula of weighing in, external factors and internal considerations about the moral responsibility of the actor for the action. And this is fundamental to a penal system that wants to respect the dignity of the offender as a son or daughter of God. And when you add in a strict liability element, you've created an inherent tension. So those 3 points, I will shut up and we will take questions. So just more added in. Christian, you want to go first, since you were right out of the gate.
Thank you, Father.
And please tell us who you are and where you're from.
Sure, thank you. I'm an attorney here in town. Father, your points on the councils and how they talk about punishment and the right method of it is very on point. But I wanted to ask the panel, I come from Philadelphia, which Mike talked about. We've had penitentiaries, many of them, but in the last 2 years has become incredibly violent. And there has been a lot of talk about how to treat those who commit severely crazy crimes, not the ones 17-year-old beating the traffic cones. This is all in the last year. Pregnant woman unloading gifts from a baby shower, she shot to death, things of that nature that really shock the conscience. But still, there's been some testing of some more lax, more dignity-focused crime preventions. How do we balance in this age of increased crime, increased shocking crime, the common good of a polity with the individual who's committed the crime to rehabilitate themselves? So the two crimes I mentioned, they were committed by 14, 15, 16, 17-year-olds. The crimes are being committed by, sadly, very young people with not the most formed reason, as you said, Professor. Do you have any sort of practical approaches on how to sell to the individuals the ability to, that we can rehabilitate these people, that they do have human dignity, but simultaneously preserving the stability of the society? Thank you.
Just one comment I make, Cecilia's going to have much more to say on this, is that unfortunately at the point of the crime we are at a bad position where we have an obligation to protect the community that's victimized by these crimes. There's a layer of complexity with the racial reckoning that the United States is going through right now. And of course, Philadelphia has a very progressive DA and Larry Krasner, who's been pushing for policies in part as part of a racial justice initiative. Of course, we tend to see the crimes perpetrated by minorities falling on their same community. So I think it's very tough because simply being lenient or sort of giving someone a second chance can be very dangerous. My own view is that the family is central to any response to this. Of course, it's too late, largely by the time a crime has been committed. But the best thing that we can do is to promote conditions in which families can flourish, where churches and communities can flourish, that can help cultivate the character and the alternatives that will help people not turn towards these crimes or not lash out in this way. COVID was extremely destructive in this way. Conditions of confinement for juveniles as well, they too often get shunted to the adult system, can be far more rehabilitative or meant to be. So I'd say at the point where we can no longer rectify the underlying conditions, we're not shunting them into the adult system, working on more rehabilitative programs that really engage them as reasoning individuals. They are highly, they have a great potential for reasoning development, moral development, more even than adults. So I think it's especially imperative with that. I'm sorry it's a bit vague. I mean, part of it's water under the bridge if you haven't corrected the conditions, but the other is to not send them to the adult system, I think, most importantly.
Yeah, I want to say this very carefully because I don't want to minimize the actual trauma and harm that crime causes, and I certainly don't mean to suggest the state doesn't have a serious role to play in trying to prevent crime and to respond to it when it occurs. But I also worry a lot about the degree of increasing risk aversion of American culture. We live in a valley of tears. This is not a perfect world, and it is an illusion, and it's actually a lie, that we can prevent all bad things from happening, and that it is somehow incumbent on the state to do so whatever the cost. We treat people who we have identified as engaging with the criminal system, and as Marah alluded to, it's not, our system responds to detected crime, not to crime that occurs in the world, right? We respond to things that we have captured, not conduct in which people have engaged. So lots of people are committing crime and not being detected. And we have lots of racial disparity in the way that we identify it. But we respond to people who have been identified as engaging in criminal conduct as sort of like walking balls of risk waiting to actualize in the world, not as beautiful souls created by Christ and intended for eternal happiness and the beatific vision, right? And of course, there have to be consequences for crime. But again, this idea that our response has to ensure that no one does anything bad ever again is kind of crazy, right? Because people are doing bad things all the time, including people who haven't previously been involved in the criminal legal system. Bad things will happen. And I think that we want to put all of the blame on 14-year-olds walking around with firearms, right, who are engaging in that kind of reasoning that 14-year-olds engage in, which is not real deep, right? Rather than on ourselves and our communities for the way that we have allowed like incredible poverty and incredible social disadvantage to just fester in concentrated neighborhoods that we don't have to look at most of the time, right? And say that that's because we're good and they're bad, right? And so there's no sense of collective responsibility. When I talk often, or not often, periodically, I will be asked to address a group of prosecutors. Usually they're ones who call themselves progressive. And they'll often talk about the challenge between feeling pressure to deliver tomorrow results from investments that can't possibly, yield results for another 5 to 10 years. And they're like, well, what are we supposed to do? Right? What do we do? We play with numbers, right? Make it look like we did something when that's not plausible. How do we teach communities patience and investment? Because rebuilding our communities won't happen overnight. So that's sort of an all over the place answer, but those are my reactions.
Okay, so in the back, and then Father, and then we'll move around. Please, again, your name and where you're from, and your question, please.
Yes, thank you. My name is Lauren Reynoso. I'm a PhD student from Yale. Thank you so much for the talk. I have, I guess a two-part question, because when at Yale, for the Blessed Michael he's interred at the church there, one of his famous, life events is his ministry to a death penalty inmate named Chip Smith, who converted during his sentencing and repented and made good confession before he died. But the other thing I was thinking of is a short story I know called The Bet, which is about whether or not the death penalty is worse than solitary confinement, and so someone puts himself in solitary for a long time. And so in both of these cases, there's a lot of reason kind of being given about what exactly they're doing. And Chip Smith is kind of explaining that, Blessed McGivney is explaining to Chip Smith how, even though he's punished and what he's punished for, and why it's so important that for his murder he has to convert. And the short story, this solitary confinement the person undergoes is voluntary. I guess one of the question I have is to what extent is the community as a whole responsible then to giving reasons for the people, for those who are convicted if the judges aren't? And what extent, or as an individual community, what extent do we have to the people who are unjustly put in solitary, even though it's not part of their sentencing or goes beyond their sentencing? Is there any responsibility on our part, or obligations, even if they're imperfect? I guess how does that play out, and what is the role between the community and the judge's failure to do this in those situations?
Thank you. So one of the chief objections that I have to solitary confinement is that it is almost entirely a choice of prison administrators, which is why it escapes the ex post facto objection that Mike mentioned that came up in the Medley case in 1890. That was a legislature adding a requirement of solitary confinement pending execution. The court strikes that down as ex post facto because it so magnifies punishment. When solitary confinement is imposed now, including on death row, we have people spending decades in solitary confinement up to execution. It's imposed by prison administrators, except for in a couple states where it's under the law. A law that was enacted when it was a couple weeks that they'd spend. Now it's an average of just over 20 years that they're going to spend pending execution. So I think our responsibility is not to allow those who do not represent the community, those who do not have punishment decisions as their responsibility to make these decisions. So solitary confinement for short periods of time might be necessary as an administrative matter for safety, say before someone's transferred to a location where they can be integrated with others under surveillance that's protective. But long-term solitary confinement is illegitimate by administrators, including because it escapes the vision and participatory action of us as members of a democracy. We are responsible for the treatment of offenders. In general, I would say prison conditions are too detached from legislators pass these conditions over to administrators. When I was doing research on solitary confinement on death row in Virginia before Virginia abolished the death penalty, I went to find the regulation governing and requiring solitary confinement, and it was at issue in a case, but it had been filed under seal. It was not only not publicly approved, not going through the notice and comment kind of process, was exempt from that, but it wasn't even published. I mean, it wasn't even subject to public scrutiny. So absolutely, we have a responsibility. We have avoided it by delegating to administrators whose perverse incentives make them much more apt to impose these degrading conditions. And the interesting thing is in the Fourth Circuit went to review this case before it too ended up mooted. They said, you know, it's just part of the death sentence. Solitary confinement is tethered to a death sentence. It's just what's been approved for these people. It is utterly and completely false. It is chosen by prison administrators who end up mooting a case by changing the regulations. They didn't want to get sued for it, so they changed it so it wasn't complete solitary confinement. So we need to face up to that. Our response is face up to what's happening and to stop pretending we can wash our hands of it. So that's my view on that.
Mike, do you want to add anything, please?
I have some thoughts on the judge's role to your question. Right now, under an Eighth Amendment challenge, it's constitutional to use solitary confinement for however long. So the judges at the trial court who are seeing these cases can't really do anything. That case that I mentioned, Hope v. Harris, when it went to the Fifth Circuit on appeal, one of the judges during oral argument asked the state, why is he in here for 25 years? Is he still really dangerous? Like, what's going on here? And the state's response was, we believe he's still dangerous, and that's because in prison, officials have high deference under the law of the punishments they impose while they're in prison. So the judges, as I mentioned, aren't really the solution to this because they're working underneath and interpreting the law that's been given to them. There's some hope. John Stiniford out of University of Florida School of Law writes about that solitary could be unusual punishment, meaning that it fell out of disuse for so long that we don't use that punishment anymore. It's not longer part of our social conscience. That's why I showed some of the history, was that you just see large gaps and also very few states using it until the supermax prisons were built.
Let me add one thing to that, just to clarify for those who don't know the law, versus administrative regulation. There is a lot of deference given to administrators who impose conditions for the reason of security, which they allege solitary confinement is needed for. I believe, even with the current court, that if there were a law imposing long-term solitary confinement as punishment, the justices might well find that unconstitutional, because that kind of treatment as punishment has never, ever in the history of the United States been imposed. It's that they avoid the label of punishment and treat it as a security condition that enables them to be subject to this deferential regime.
Okay, a couple more quick questions, Fowler, and then there's someone in the back as well, and then Sir.
I'm Godwin Adike, I study in Rome. And I should have gone at 10, but I saw this and I said I wouldn't miss it. The car is waiting now.
Thank you.
Honestly, I'm writing on penal law, and you guys have answered a whole lot of questions I would have had in mind a whole lot of time. Especially with you seeing the goodness and all. But I've always seen this problem, because when I was writing on justice, Father, you mentioned that our definition of justice, although we can't finish thinking about it up to now, but our definition of justice should not just be given to each what is due to him or her. I have just two references. Day before yesterday, I saw two men being burnt. You know, in our country there is still this jungle justice. And they were being burnt, and this was posted by a priest on his profile, on his status, on the WhatsApp status. I was like, what's happened? What's this? And he said, those men have been dealing with us in this state. I said, okay, what did they do? Like, they don't deserve to be punished like this. As a matter of fact, a young boy, I don't know, he would just be 18 or 17, picked a whole lump of stone and threw it on these men that were already on fire. Like, it was so dehumanizing to watch. And I asked, and he said, do you know that a priest was shot by these people and his car snatched? And he was kidnapped by the same people. Another priest was kidnapped by the same people. And I was like, okay, how do we judge? He asked something like this, but how do we judge a situation that there is this blatant recidivism, right, on people that we recognize you're good. You're created in the image and likeness of God, but you're doing things that they're just not wonderful. So, at what sense can we carry the justice of God and then merge it with the dispensation that's only in canon law, is not in penal law, in dispensation that is in canon law, in such a way that we don't try to rob them and smother what they have done and not, what is it called, lay down on what they have done. The second one is on the prison system. I wrote when I was a seminarian 4 or 5 years ago. I have written on this prison system, and I actually went to the prison. And I saw the situation going on in the prison, and it's as though these people, they don't see themselves more, they don't see themselves as humans again. And how do you try to, somebody has decided, even in the prison, there is even more crimes than outside. There are gangs and people are being raped, treated, and so how are we going to practically really reform? We are talking about now, a lot of things, solitary confinement, but it's still going on. 20 years later, it's still going on. How are we going to really make people who have been termed offenders or felons to know that they are not this way? And how are we going to really practically work on their mentality and side to understand that they could even surpass this, even after be it solitary confinement or long years of imprisonment?
No, I'll pass. We'll give a brief response because we're coming to the end of time. So just brief thoughts, if we may, so we can get into the last few questions.
Well, thank you, Father, for adding that international perspective for us, right? I mean, this is not just an American problem. You know, so often in our, whether it's in our courtrooms or in our press or in our prisons, we tell people that they're monsters, right? That they're incorrigible, that they're felons. That's not news to them. Most of the people in our prisons have been told that their whole life, right? All they've been told is how bad they are. What they've never been told is that they're made in God's image. They've never been shown love. And for many, too many people, there has never been hope or love. And one of the questions I think you posed, how do we help? Well, certainly right now, the job of prison administrator and prison staff, neither the staff nor those of us in the community conceive of as a job about restoring hope in the human person. And I would suggest that most of us will respond to the messages and labels that we're given, right? We rise or fall to the expectations of those around us. And so it shouldn't surprise us that given the way we warehouse people and try actively to crush their hope and sense of self and agency and autonomy, right? Success in prison is all about passivity. Just do what you're told when you're told. Be quiet, stay out of the way, right? It shouldn't surprise us that people don't return to our communities filled with hope and restoration. When they do, they're defying the odds. We are not making that easier for them. And I think you raised lots of complex questions also about who we are as people in the community. What do we tolerate? And I think that we need to do a lot more examinations of our own consciences about what we are comfortable doing to our fellow men.
I will just add one thing. I'm sorry. So one of the gifts that we have in at least inside the church and inside the system is that we are still allowed to make a distinction between sin and crime. All of the crimes in the church are sins, but clearly all sins are not criminalized. And this distinction, at least from a Catholic perspective, at least within the life of the church, allows us to limit the behaviors which we label felons, actual criminal activity, but still have as its foundation the constant understanding of the necessary rehabilitation of the offender. Because the offender is first and foremost a sinner. And like any sinner, a sinner is called to be moved by the Holy Spirit to seek reconciliation, and in the reconciliation in the process of reconciliation, to do penance. So there's first that again, within the Catholic legal system, we have that ability to continue to distinguish between sin and crime, so that we can, again, differentiate the level of gravity in that way. Please.
Just to the point of justice, someone asked, I looked up, there's a quick quote from St. Bonaventure that a friend pulled out for me the other day that's been giving me a lot to think about, and I think it's relevant to our conversation here. St. Bonaventure says, justice embellishes the whole world. It makes beautiful what had been deformed. It makes more beautiful what was already beautiful, and most beautiful what had been improved. I would suggest that's not the definition of justice that the American criminal system operates under.
So last two questions quickly.
Can I add
Sorry.
one
Oh,
point,
sorry, please,
just
Marah.
on that? I think that we have to face the reality that unless we put resources into the criminal justice system, we cannot make its conditions better. And I want to give an example of solitary confinement and prison rape. Solitary confinement is protective in many ways. Solitary confinement is protective to other people. It is destructive of the person in it. Simply eliminating solitary confinement is, and sometimes it's protect the person in it, say sex offenders. You are going to need more guards. You are going to need more resources. You are going to need larger prisons if you want to get rid of it. And we are not willing to do so in part because we shunt the responsibility for the conditions to people who are not democratically directly accountable and who are not very visible. I'm afraid we might not be so merciful even if we saw them, but it needs money, and one way to do it, other than infusing money, is to criminalize less so we don't have to house as many people. The reality is there will be costs, and the same is going to be true in other countries. It is expensive. I think it's even harder there. It is complex. You can't just say, let's all be nice to one another, because we have a response. We take away the weapons of the people in our prisons and put them with people who are violent. That is not an answer. Let's be lenient. Let's just let them hang out together. Like, we have to protect them, and they are now rendered defenseless. So I think it is extraordinarily complex. And unless we are willing to sacrifice funds or the risk of not criminalizing certain things, like Cecelia said, we need to be more willing to accept risk, keeping in mind that's largely going to be not most of our communities that suffer, right? I don't see necessarily a way, I really don't see a way forward unless we infuse resources. Because the sad thing is people take time to become better. They are dangerous, many people in prisons.
Yes, sir.
I'm Phil Sloan. I'm from Notre Dame, but I've also had experience teaching both in the Moral College prison program and also the Westfield prison. And I've also had some very good conversations with late Dean Dave Lincoln and Don Covers of law school. And I think one of the things that I was impressed with was Don Commerce, you can correct me, Don Commerce is saying in the German Constitution, you cannot be sentenced for more than 12 years without having your case reassessed. And I think that would be one of the crucial kind of reforms we have. Dean Lincoln introduced me to a young man that had a 140-year sentence out of prison. I said, how do you get a 140-year sentence? I read in the paper 2 days later, a local person was in a drive-by shooting in the car. He got 35 years for that. He got 35 years for being in a gang and 35 years for resisting arrest, 105 years. And he didn't actually shoot the gun. Now, I mean, these are the kind of things that we have to deal with. But I think that having had experience in teaching in the prison and seeing how that's transformative, there's where resources should really go in. I think that they would be very important. Our recidivism rate in the Moral College program is something like 3%. Bard has been doing it for 25 years. They have an 8% recidivism because people are treated like human beings. They learn for the first time in their lives to respect it, that people take it seriously, and it's transformative. So I think that there's a lot of ways we can invest resources. It isn't just housing. I think it's other kinds of resources.
Thank you very much. And there's one more question in the back, please, and then we'll call it a session, please.
This can be really fast. My name is Grace Ferguson. I just graduated from the University of Dallas. We talk about like justice, and we have this concept of like just punishment, but we also talk about like keeping other people safe, like putting people in solitary confinement for like protective measures. Do you think there's any place at all, this can be for anyone, for solitary confinement in our justice system, or is it just like hands down, intrinsically, inherently immoral, and like is there any place at all for it?
So there is a place for it. Like, when I give my presentation, I talk about prolonged solitary confinement using the UN definition of more than 15 days, because that's where the psychological effects start to kick in. But when you administer a prison and a guy kills another cellmate, you can't just put him in another cell. You need to cool it off, or there's a fight in the prison and the guards need to separate it and just figure out what's going on. So there's uses for it that are legitimate. It's just the extent of time that is the problem, where it's not, it violates human dignity. but you have to use it in some circumstances to cool things down just because they're incredibly violent. Like, I was listening to Jailhouse Calls in the summer, and on Rikers Island, they're constantly lighting fires in the prison. They're constantly smoking themselves out. That's not even talking about the rapes and stabbings, like, they are incredibly violent. So, guards need some way to manage a prison, and they're managing violent men, usually, and it can get unwieldy.
Yeah, and another thing is that the conditions in solitary confinement do not have to be so confining. They don't have to be so cruel. You have an airlock indoors, you can have multiple open sort of mesh fences that keep people from physically encountering one another, but where they can still see each other and dialogue, right? And dialogue may not be nice, in fact, it's unlikely to be, but to have that human contact, to have a place for recreation. Solitary confinement is defined as a specific thing. It doesn't have to be that way. So some of the necessary constraints, not all of them, right? Some else.
Well, I want to thank our panelists for and to all of you for being here. So go and enjoy your lunch. Respect each other, treat each other with dignity.